There are rulers who are remembered for what they did. And then we have those rulers who are remembered for what they convinced the world they were. King Louis XIV belongs entirely to the second category. He did not simply inherit a crown and issue laws. He transformed himself into a living symbol, a political performance so constant and so convincing that France itself began to orbit around his presence. Louis XIV did not just want obedience, he wanted belief. He wanted people to feel that his existence was necessary for order, beauty, stability, and even time itself. He presented himself not as the man who ruled France, but as the force that made France function. Like the sun, he rose every morning, set every evening, and determined that the rhythm of life around him. This episode is not only about power or wars and palaces. It is about the fear disguised as confidence, the insecurity transformed into ceremony, and the strange reality that a man who barely bathed, suffered endlessly from illnesses, and was terrified of disorder, managed to define elegance, culture, and authority for generations to come. Welcome back, guys, to the Storytelling Podcast, your cozy corner of captivating tales. I'm your host, Alejandra, and today I have another long episode, and we are dividing the extravagant, obsessive, dramatic, and often ridiculous life of King Louis XIV of France, better known as the Sun King. Shall we? Louis XIV was born in 1638. After more than 20 years of failed attempts by the royal couple to produce an heir. His birth was interpreted as a divine intervention, not just by the public, but by the monarchy itself. He was named Louis Dieudonné, meaning God-given, and from his earliest years, he was treated less like a child and more like a sacred object. His survival mattered more than the affection. His symbolism mattered more than comfort. And despite the celebrations surrounding his birth, Louis' early life unfolded during one of the most unstable periods in the French history. The Fronde, a series of civil wars led by rebellious nobles and parliamentarians, broke out while he was still a child, and he experienced hunger, displacement, and fear firsthand. He was forced to flee Paris under threat, watched mobs rage outside palace gates, and learned very early that authority could be challenged violently. These experiences left a permanent mark. Louis grew up convinced that chaos lurked beneath politeness, and that nobles could never be trusted, and that the distance between the ruler and the ruled was dangerous. Control, he learned, was safety, and visibility was power. When Cardinal Mazarin died in 1661, many assumed Louis would follow tradition and appoint another powerful minister to govern his place. Instead, Louis, well, guys, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to be exchanging between Louis to Louis to Louis. For me, it's Louis, but the majority, of course, of my audience is in English. So if you see me struggling, it's because it's between my English and between my French, okay? So bear with me, okay? As I was saying, Louis was stunned the court by declaring that he would rule alone. He will not have a cardinal. So basically, normally you have the king and then you have all the advisors. So in this place, and because he was very young, he decided not to have any cardinal or anyone from the church helping him, if you know what I mean. And of course, this was not a youthful arrogance from his part, which later we know that it was, but it was a calculated reaction to everything that he had witnessed as a child. The very fact is that Louis XIV, because of what he saw before, he had issues. And guys, he had issues, and we're going to expand this during this episode. And Louis believed that sharing the power created rival centers of authority. He had seen ministers overshadow kings, and he had seen nobles challenging the crown. His response was radical simplicity. Everything would pass through him. Every decision, every policy, every appointment would originate from his will. And this decision redefined monarchy back then. The state was no longer separate from the king. The state would become the king, and Louis was not ruling France, he was embodying it. Versailles is often described as one of the most beautiful palaces ever built, and it is. I'm telling you as firsthand, it is. And the beauty was never it was never the primary function. Control was. When Louis XIV decided to move the royal court away from Paris and into what had once been the modest hunting lodge, he was not chasing comfort or scenery. He was executing a psychological strategy shaped by fear, memory, and absolute calculation. He calculated everything. And Paris reminded him of rebellion, mobs, and nobles who once forced him flee in the night as a child. And Versailles was isolation, distance, and a submission disguised as a luxury. Every architectural decision served his goals, so the endless corridors were not designed for ease, but for confusion, actually. And nobles could get lost in the palace, meant to impress them. Bedrooms were cramped, poorly ventilated, and often shared, ensuring privacy was almost non-existent. Walls were thin, and secrets traveled fast, and the reputation became fragile. These environments bred competition, jealousy, gossip, and anxiety, all of which worked perfectly in the king's favor. A noble distracted by court drama was a noble not plotting a rebellion. And Versailles also drained money deliberately. Maintaining appearances required constant spending on clothing, wigs, servants, and gifts. And nobles ruined themselves financially just to remain relevant. Once wealthy families became dependent on royal pensions, and dependence meant obedience. And Versailles did not house power. It dissolved it and redistributed it upwards. Louis XIV understood something deeply unsettling about the human nature. People will accept humiliation if it comes wrapped in prestige. His daily routine became a system of a ceremonial obedience, so intricate that entire lives revolved around meaningless gestures. The king's morning, the awakening, known as the lever, was divided into stages, and certain nobles could enter early. Others had to wait. Some were allowed to hand him a sleeve, others merely observed. These distinctions meant everything. A man who once commanded armies could spend decades hoping for the honor of holding a candlestick while the king dressed. Dinner was eaten publicly, with nobles standing and watching him chew. Even bedtime, the coucher, was a ceremony. Access to the king's physical presence became the highest form of currency at court. And Louis barely had to give direct orders, actually. The system enforced itself. Nobles policed their own behavior because status was fragile and visibly constant, and power no longer required force, it required attention. This did not simply rule through law and punishment. He ruled through a spectacle, repetition, and exhaustion, his favorite. He understood instinctively that power becomes unquestionable when it feels natural, and nothing feels more natural than a routine performed beautifully. This is where art entered politics, not just as a decoration, but as an infrastructure. Louis danced not because he enjoyed it, but because it placed his body at the center of meaning. Court ballets were not light entertainment. They were carefully choreographed allegories in which Louis always played order itself. Gods, heroes, cosmic forces, and inevitably the sun revolved around him. His most famous performance as Apollo was not a subtle symbolism. It was instruction. The audience was not meant to admire his dancing skills. They were meant to absorb the idea, the balance, the rhythm, the harmony existed through him only. These performances were exhausting, both physically and mentally, but Louis persisted because they worked, and nobles rehearsed for months just to appear near him on stage, and a simple misstep could mean social death. Art became a loyalty test, and participation became submission disguised as culture. But let's talk about fashion. Fashion under Louis XIV was not about beauty, comfort, or self expression. It was about control. Everything is about control in this case. Louis understood something deeply intuitive about human psychology. People obey more willingly when hierarchy is visible. Clothing became a language that spoke before a person even opened their mouth. At Versailles, they did not ask what matter or who matters. You could see it instantly. Louis regulated fashion with the same precision he applied to politics. Specific fabrics were restricted to certain ranks, and certain colors were reserved for royal only. Embroidery, lace, buttons, and even shoe decorations were marked as a proximity to power. Wearing something inappropriate was not a fashion mistake, it was a political error. Louis himself was the ultimate reference point. He was not especially tall, but height mattered enormously in a court obsessed with presence and visibility. High heels were not a style choice, they were a correction. His red-soled shoes signaled a dominance, a power, and the royal blood. Over time, red soles became a status symbol copied excessively by nobles desperate to resemble him. And when his hair began thinning, Louis did not hide it, he exaggerated it. Wigs grew taller, fuller, and more elaborate, transforming aging into authorities. And soon, wigs became mandatory. Men who had never questioned their natural hair suddenly shaved their heads to match the king. Comfort was irrelevant, but appearance, that was obedience. At Versailles, clothing was never just clothing. It was depth mixed with anxiety, mixed with ambition, and it was survival altogether, stitched with silk and gold thread. And under Louis, fashion became one of the most effective tools of political control ever devised, precisely because it appeared harmless. No one was forced to spend extravagantly. They simply had to, or if they wished to exist in the court or, appear. Court life demanded constant visual renewal. An outfit worn twice too close together became a silent announcement of decline. And wigs had to grow taller, lace had to become more intricate, and shoes had to shine brighter. Jewelry had to multiply. Nobles who had once lived comfortable or, inherited wealth, they found themselves emerging money simply to remain visible within the palace walls. And the brilliance of the system lay in its illusion of choice. Nobles destroyed their own finances willingly, chasing relevance and favor, and those who ran out of money became dependent on royal pensions, and dependence was loyalty in its purest form. A noble who owed everything to the king was a noble who would never rebel. And Louis did not confiscate power. He let people spend it into submission. From the outside, Versailles appeared orderly, symmetrical, and serene. It's a beautiful place. If you haven't been there, go please, once in your lifetime, because it's beautiful. But daily life inside the palace was anything but calm. Thousands of people lived, worked, visited, or lingered within its walls at any given time. Courtiers, servants, soldiers, musicians, artists, priests, messengers, guards, and visiting nobles moved constantly through the same corridors, staircases, and rooms, and creating a level of noise and congestion that never truly stopped. Versailles was alive at all hours, not because of celebration, but because presence itself was survival. You just had to be there, to be visible. And privacy was almost non existent. Bedrooms were small, and shared, as I said before, and frequently reassigned according to rank and favor. Walls were thin and doors were rarely locked, and servants moved freely between rooms, carrying information as efficiently as they carried trays. And conversations, they were overheard. Arguments were noted, relationships were observed, and silence was suspicious. At Versailles, someone was always watching, listening, or reporting. Sleep became fragmented and restless, and many nobles did not have permanent beds. Some slept on folding furniture or improvised pallets, simply to remain inside the palace overnight. We need to remind that between them, from Paris to where Versailles is, it took a long time to go, and many things could happen, or you were assaulted in the way, but it was easier for people to stay there. And of course, they wanted to stay there because they wanted to be near the king. And living Versailles was an absence, and absence meant invisibility. And in a court where visibility was power, exhaustion was a necessary sacrifice. People stayed awake, attended endless events, and endured physical discomforts just because disappearing, even briefly, could mean losing everything they had spent years trying to secure. Despite these glittering halls and manicured gardens, Versailles was profoundly unsanitary. The palace had far fewer latrines that required for its population. For those that don't know what latrines is, it's bathrooms. But chamber pots were common, and their contents were emptied whenever convenient. Stairwells, corridors, gardens, and occasionally directly out of the windows. And the idea of private bathroom spaces, as we understand them today, simply did not exist back then. And people relieved themselves behind curtains, tapestries, and discreet corners, often in full view of others. This behavior was not considered shocking or rude, it was normal. And servants, poor guys, cleaned the best they could, but the sheer volume of waste made cleanliness impossible. The smell was constant, layered, and unavoidable. This is where perfume became essential. Not decorative, essential, guys. Heavy floral scents were used to overpower the reality of human waste, sweat, illness, and decay. Elegance at Versailles was not clean. It was denial. Everyone agreed not to acknowledge what lay beneath the silk lace-empowered wigs. You know what I mean, right? And refinement became a collective performance in which everyone pretended not to notice, the rot holding it all together. Now, one of the notes that I have to say here is that when we imagine those long, flowy, dresses, those skirts with so many skirts underneath, the skirts were perfect in this position for women, okay? But you know what I mean, right? So yeah, fashion, it could be, that saying that what's it's outside, it doesn't mean that inside is the same. By the standards of modern medicine, it is almost miraculous that Louis XIV lived as long as he did. Because most of his life, his body was subjected to treatments that border as a torture. 17th century medicine operated under the belief that illness was caused by imbalance, and restoring balance meant removing fluids from the body in dramatic quantities. You might have heard this or not, but bloodletting was not an occasional measure, but a routine one, performed for headaches, fevers, discongestive discomfort, fatigue, and even emotional distress. Oh, I have a headache. Let's do bloodletting like with 2 pints of blood or 2 liters of blood. Oh, I'm feeling, my hair is aching. Let's do blood. That's how it worked, actually. And Louis submitted to these procedures with remarkable discipline. His veins were opened repeatedly, and enemas, if you don't know, it's water put on your behind, were administered so frequently that they became a joke at court. although never once spoke loud. Of course, he's the king. And purges induce violent vomiting and diarrhea, leaving him weak but obedient to the medical authority. The king believed deeply in his wisdom and in his doctors, and even as the treatment slowly eroded his strength. What made this suffering extraordinary was its visibility. The king's body was not private. His illnesses were reported, discussed, anticipated, and interpreted as signs of divine favor or warning. When the king endured pain without complaint, it reinforced the idea that endurance was noble. His body became a political instrument, demonstrating resilience, authority, and obedience. And of course, it has divine protection. Now, one of the most infamous medical episodes on Louis' life was the development of an anal fistula, a painful and debilitating condition that left him barely able to sit, ride, or walk comfortably. The condition worsened over time, and doctors eventually conclude that surgery was unavoidable. This was a terrifying prospect in an era without anesthesia, without antibiotics, or proper sterilization. The operation was treated as a matter of national importance. Of course, it was the king, and surgeons practiced the procedure repeatedly beforehand on volunteers, because someone had to volunteer, and on prisoners, and perfecting their technique out of sheer terror of failure. They couldn't kill the king, right? When the day came, Louis endured the operation, fully conscious, gripping the table while surgeons cut into the infected tissue. And recovery took months and involved intense pain, infections, and limited mobility. But the king survived, and the relief was immense. Church bells rang, Te Deums were sung, and songs were written about this. Medals were minted. The successful surgery was framed as a divine intervention, of course, and further reinforcing the idea that Louis ruled with God's favor. In a strange twist of history, the procedure became fashionable among doctors who proudly performed similar surgeries or named instruments after the king. His suffering had become a medical trend. Not talking about crazy trends, right? No, this trend, I just skip it. Now, talking about his marriage and his relations. So, Louis married Maria Theresa of Spain as a political necessity devoid of emotional intimacy. The queen fulfilled her role quietly, producing heirs and maintaining dignity, but she never occupied the emotional center of the king's life. The space was filled by his mistresses, whose influence extended far beyond the bedroom. Louise de la Vallière was his first great love. She was shy, deeply devoted, and emotionally overwhelmed by court life. Her sincerity contrasted sharply with the artificiality of Versailles, and her visible suffering eventually exhausted her. Her retreat into a convent was less a spiritual awakening than a collapse under pressure. And then we have Madame of Montespan, followed bringing intelligence, ambition, and theatrical confidence. She dominated the court life, influenced appointments, controlled access, and lived surrounded by luxury. Her powers were intoxicating, and she made enemies. When the affair of the poisons erupted, and I'm going to be talking about this in the near future, it involved accusations of witchcraft, poisonings, and black masses among members of the aristocracy. A Montespan name became dangerously entangled. Whether she was guilty or merely associated did not matter. Suspicion alone ended her reign. And then, after Montespan was evicted, I'm not going to say more, then came Madame de Maintenon. She was calm, restrained, and deeply religious. She offered Louis stability instead of passion, and over time, her influence reshaped him completely. Under her guidance, the king grew more pious, less tolerant, and increasingly moralistic. Pleasure faded, but control intensified. As Louis grew older, something subtle but powerful changed him. The confident ruler, who once relied on spectacle and excess, began to turn inward. His energy shifted from performance to control, from pleasure to guilt, from confidence to fear of disorder. The chaos of his childhood never truly left him, and in his years later, it resurfaced into a new form, a belief that difference itself was dangerous. Religion became the lens through which Louis interpreted stability. Diversity of beliefs, once tolerated for practical reasons, now felt like a crack in the structure that he had spent his life building. And Protestantism, in particular, represented independence, private conscience, and a resistance to the centralized authority that he wanted. And to Louis, this wasn't acceptable. Unity meant obedience, and obedience meant peace. And peace, he believed, could only exist if everyone believed the same things in the same way that he wanted. And the revocation of the Edict of Nantes was not a sudden decision. It was a result of years of pressure, persuasion, and fear, and Protestant churches were closed gradually. Children were removed from families to be raised Catholic, and conversions were encouraged, then coerced, then forced. Violence was rarely official, but it was tolerated, and the goal was not persuasion, it was erasure. By the later decades in his reign, war was not simply a political tool for Louis XIV. It had become a habit, almost a reflex, deeply woven into his understanding of what it was meant to rule. For Louis, peace felt passive, dangerous, and strangely empty. War, on the other hand, created movement, urgency, and visibility. It reminded Europe that the sun was still shining, and that France was still powerful, and that the king himself was still relevant. Early wars had rewarded his mindset. They brought territory, prestige, and international fear. Victories were painted, sculpted, sung about, and permanently carved into architecture of Versailles. Louis grew accustomed to success being loud and visible, and over time this created a dangerous illusion that the war itself was proof of greatness and regardless of outcome. Don't we see this so many times in history? As the years passed, wars became less strategic and more habitual. Conflicts stretched on endlessly, not because they were winnable, but because stopping them felt like admitting a decline. And Louis no longer fought to expand France so much as to preserve the image he had spent his life constructing. War became a way to outrun aging, doubts, and creeping awareness that the world was changing faster than he could control. By the time that the War of the Spanish Succession began, Louis XIV was no longer the energetic ruler that once had ridden at the head of armies and danced in the embodiment of cosmic order. He was an aging monarch, ruling through memory, habits, and momentum. Yet this war mattered to him more than any other one, because it wasn't simply about borders or influence, it was about his legacy. When the Spanish king died without an heir, the question of succession ignited Europe. For Louis, placing a Bourbon relative on the Spanish throne felt natural, almost inevitable. And dynasties, in his mind, were not random. They were expressions of divine order. If France was chosen by God to flourish under his rule, then extending influence through bloodlines felt like a destiny fulfilling itself. But Europe did not share that vision. And other powers saw the potential union of French and Spanish influence as an existential threat. And alliances formed quickly and aggressively. What followed was not a swift assertion of dominance, but a grinding, an exhausting conflict that spanned years, continents, and generations of soldiers. This was not the kind of war Louis understood. It did not offer clear victories or glorious finales. It demanded endless resources, constant adaptations, and humility. And humility, well, let's just say that it wasn't something that Louis have ever needed before, right? One of the great tragedies of Louis's later reign is that he was no longer truly free to choose peace. His identity had been built so thoroughly around strength, dominance, and inevitability that stepping back felt like a collapse. A king who stopped fighting risked appearing weak, and weakness in Louis' mind invited chaos. And irony is cruel, and the very image that he had spent decades crafting now controlled him. He could not withdraw without undermining everything that he represented. So, if the war continued, not because it was wise, it was just to stop what it felt impossible. And reports of defeated arrived alongside the reports of famine. And requests for more money came from collectors that returned empty handed from villages that were already stripping bare. And Louis read everything. He signed everything. You know, there was this distance between decision and consequence that started to grow apart. And war had become an obligation to the past, but it wasn't a strategy for the future. The winter of 1709 was one of the harshest in Europe, and for France, it was catastrophic. Temperatures dropped so low that rivers froze solid. Crops failed completely, and livestock died in massive numbers. Bread disappeared. People ate bark, roots, and anything remotely edible. Entire villages starved. Disease followed hunger. Parents buried children, and children wandered alone. The countryside fell silent not because of peace, but because of exhaustion and death. And Versailles felt the effects very faintly. Food grew scarcer, prices rose, but the ritual continued. The king still dined formally. Court etiquette remained intact. The illusion of stability was preserved because acknowledged collapse would have meant, confronting the limits of power. And this was the moment where the gap between spectacle and reality became impossible to ignore. But no one dared to speak it aloud. By the final years of his reign, Louis faced something that he had spent his entire life avoiding: the loss of control. Not political control, not military control, but control over his own body. For a man who had ruled through image, repetition, and ritual, aging was not simply, and this reminds me of the meme, aging was not simply physical decline. It was non-existential crisis. And pain became constant rather than episodic. Walking was slow and deliberate. Standing for long ceremonies exhausted him. Eating caused discomfort. Sleep was broken. And the body that once symbolized endurance, authority, and a divine favor now betrayed him daily. And there was no ritual powerful enough to hide it completely. Yet, Louis refused to abandon performance. Even as his strength faded, he clung to the routine, that near religious devotion to the spectacle. The lever still took place, and meals were still public. Ceremonies were shortened, though, but not cancelled, and the illusion of continuity mattered more than the comfort. If the king still rose every morning according to the ritual, then the world in his mind remained intact. Versailles in Louis's final years was quieter, heavier, and haunted by absence. The court still functioned, but the energy has changed. It grew older. Many of the great figures who once defined court life were gone. Familiar faces had either died or fallen from favor, and new courtiers arrived who had never known the king in his prime and treated him less like a son and more like an institution. The palace itself began to feel more like a monument rather than a living space. And ceremonies still continue because stopping them would meant acknowledging a decline. Music still played, and etiquette was still in force, but the intensity was gone. What remained was the habit of what an era was. And this was a court running only by memories, on stories of what the king had once been, on portraits that show youth, strength, and confidence that no longer existed in reality. Versailles was preserved in the past so carefully that it became trapped inside of it. One of the cruelest ironies of Louis' life is that he lived too long. He outlived rivals, allies, lovers, children, and even grandchildren. He buried heirs one by one. Each funeral reduced the future that he had imagined for his dynasty. By the end, the succession passed to a great grandchild, a fragile boy too young to understand the weight of the crown he would inherit. And Louis, who had once embodied vitality and continuity, now looked at the future and saw uncertainty. And there wasn't an extension of himself, something that he really fought for. And survival, once a triumph, became a burden. The longer he lived, the more alone he became. And power remained, but companionship vanished. The sun still shone, but it did so over in an empty land. As death approached, something softened in Louis. The absolute certainty that had defined him for decades loosed his grip. Pain stripped away performance, and mortality demanded uh, honesty. In his final days, Louis spoke openly about his mistakes. He warned against endless wars. He advised moderation, restraint, and humility to those who rule after him. These words carried weight precisely because they contradicted so much that he did in his life. And this repentance is dramatic in a sense. It was his recognition, the recognition that power has limits, that recognition that spectacle could not defeat time, and that recognition that even the sun sets. When Louis died in 1715, after 72 years on the throne, France entered a moment unlike anyone know. Entire generations that had lived and died under his rule. But for many, he was not just a king, he was the background of existence. The reaction was complex, actually, but there was this genuine grief. People cried and churches filled. But beneath the mourning was something quieter and harder to define. It was, all honesty, I think it was the relief. The reign that had been magnificent, but it was also very exhausting. And when the Sun King disappeared, the world did not collapse. The sun still rose, time continued, and France continued to breathe. But Louis XIV's greatest legacy was not Versailles. It wasn't war or even art. It was the system that he created, a centralized state, a culture of obedience, a belief that order flowed from visibility and control. And these systems continue after him. They shaped France long after his death, and they also carried within like the seeds of a future disaster. It was a lesson in French history. And absolute control suppresses conflict temporarily, but it does not remove it. It stores heat. So what Louis built with brilliance and discipline could later collapse under pressure, and he never lived to witness. Louis did not live to see the revolution, of course, but revolution lived inside the structures that he created it. Inequality, exhaustion, resentment, and distance between power and the people grew quietly beneath the surface of his reign. He centralized authority so effectively that when it finally broke, it broke violently. The sun that once unified the systems became the point from which everything radiated outward, including collapsed. Louis XIV began a life as a miracle child and ended it as a metaphor. He represented absolute power, human fragility, brilliance, excess, fear, and control all at once. He believed deeply that order required visibility, hierarchy, and obedience. And for decades, he was right. But no system built entirely around one person can last forever. And when the Sun King finally set, France was left to face a world without him and to discover how much he had hidden beneath his light. And this was today's episode, guys. I hope you liked it. It was a very long episode. But comment below and share your thoughts about this. What do you think about his life, about him as a personality? And we have so many stories about control and kings and tyrants, but he wasn't a tyrant. He was just moved by his own personal issues, his own fragilities, and this created, because he wasn't a bad guy. You know, we cannot say, oh, this king was so macabre. No, actually, no. But when I was ending the script for this episode and the part of where he dies, you can notice on my voice, actually, I get sad on this because he's such an important person in history, and there are so many lessons in here. If you hear the episode again, or in the first time that you hear this episode, you can see that so many things are being repeated over and over in our history. And yeah, it's one of those personalities that I really wanted to talk about. And I'm going to pick up a couple of things from here, and it's already written. But we have so much more from Louis XIV reign. And yeah, I have other episodes ready for you as you have been listening. So here I'm going to try to share at least 3 or 2 times per week. And if you want to send me your special topics, or if you want to ask for anything, you know that you can always reach me on the Storytelling Podcast 8080@gmail.com, or follow me on social media at the Storytelling Podcast. But guys, it's always nice to hear your comments and your emails, and thank you for listening. And before you go, if you haven't done that already, I would love for you to click on the follow or subscribe button, and see you on the next episode.